After a picturesque 6-hour bus journey from Belize City, we arrived in Flores at sunset and went straight to the hostel. Again, basic, but it did the job. We dropped the bags and went straight out for tacos. More tacos. More tacos. And a margarita. Salut!
We didn't realise it would come around quite so soon, but Beth had to pay the taco tax again.
And the cherry on top was the fact that our bedroom and the bathroom were directly opposite the receptionist, who for 6 hours heard me excising the devil during the night.
I've got nothing left. I've got nothing left.
We started our day in Flores with a walk around the beautifully coloured buildings on the island, then had a wander over the bridge to buy a SIM card for our time in Guatemala. After a lengthy process of going back to back from desk to desk in the phone shop, we headed back into town and went for a bagel for breakfast in an attempt to line Beth's stomach.
After about half an hour of walking round, we'd completed Flores Island, and we read that you can get a boat over to the mainland on the north side called San Miguel. It was risky business straying this far from a toilet, but I was feeling a bit devil-may-care, and we only had one day in Flores, so I thought we should make the most of it.
It took about 5 minutes to get across at the hefty price of about £1 each, and when we got over there it was a tad desolate, and it was about 37 degrees. We followed an all trails map to get to the top of one of the nearby hills for a great viewpoint of the island of Flores.
After about 45 minutes of pure sweat, we finally made it to the viewpoint, and in hindsight, one sachet of electrolyte powder was not sufficient for this walk. But it was worth it because there were some absolute scenes from the top.
This is Lake Petinitza. To the north lies Mayan ruins and vast nature reserves. And to the south you can see the island of Flores, the white building at the top being where Beth got her dodgy stomach.
On the way down we stopped off at a cafe for some fruit and smoothies to replenish the nutrients lost, and then bought some 80p dog food to feed this skinny gal.
Randomly we stumbled on this boardwalk going through the jungle. It weaved around past bird boxes and then onto these ruins at the top of the hill. Then onto this viewpoint of Flores with the cenote just before it. We went to a Honduran restaurant for dinner and I forced Beth to have a bottle of electrolyte drink before we went to bed.
The next morning we were up at 4:30 in order to catch a 6 a.m. bus. The bus went from Flores to Rio Dulce and it took 5 hours. But this journey was a lot more comfortable than the last because we managed to snag the back seat so we could actually lay down. But on the flip side, the fans weren't working, so it was a very sweaty journey. And there's no toilets, so you can't drink much water either. We arrived in the town of Rio Dulce and, as directed by the hotel, headed towards a cafe on the pier, but then passed by a brewery, so obviously had a flight of beers en route. It was Friday after all.
Then we went to a cafe for a quick spot of lunch where they called our hostel, who came by boat pick us up.
We stayed in Casa Perico in Rio Dulce, which was by far the coolest accommodation we've had. Again, the room was pretty basic, but it had a heavy-duty mosquito net, which was definitely required.
We also received a warm welcome from the toilet attendant.
Brother, what's that?
Then spend the rest of the afternoon chilling in the hammocks.
They also had a bunch of canoes that you could just take out whenever you wanted, so you could just have a paddle down the river. So obviously me and Jack did this every day we were there. They also had their own little floating pontoon out in the main river, and we got there just in time for sunset. After a short paddle back, we both got ready for dinner. And you can't really get anywhere else unless you're on a boat. So we both had food at the accommodation and had spaghetti bolognese.
We woke up and had breakfast and decided to book a last-minute trip to Livingston on the coast. The journey there was an hour and a half, and the boat trip alone was worth it as it was very similar to sailing through Jurassic Park. We stopped off at a few places en route, including hot springs and an island covered in birds. The main two kind of birds were herons and cormorants, and they made a right old racket in the trees. Have a listen. Then slowed down at one point to see the equivalent of Guatemala's White Cliffs of Dover. After some more scenic views along the river, we received a warm welcome to Livingston by this large group of pelicans.
Jack had found some waterfalls to go and visit, so when we arrived in Livingston, we hopped on a tuk-tuk for about 15 minutes, and then it was a half an hour walk in the blazing sun to get to the waterfalls.
The waterfalls were easy to find, you just had to follow the coastline until you got to it. It started off incredibly picturesque, but as we carried on and it got more remote, we started to see more and more plastic along the beachfront until it covered most of the floor.
Then as we approached the waterfall, disaster struck. My flip-flop broke, so Jack used part of an old military bag to strap it up. And then when we finally got to the waterfall, there was barely any water in it. This is as good as it got. Instead of hobbling back, we decided to take the water taxi, where they completely overfilled a very small boat. The sea was incredibly rough and all the kids were crying, so when we eventually got off we were completely soaked.
The boat eventually pulled up to shore and we were nowhere near where we needed to be. But some friendly locals who were on the boat with us offered us a tuk-tuk ride back into town. And once back in town, we grabbed some local ginger cakes to get us through to dinner.
We made it back to the hotel boat with about half an hour to spare. So although we didn't actually see much of the town of Livingston, it was still quite a good day out. Made better by some more incredible scenes on the journey back.
Then before calling it a day, we grabbed a canoe and had a quick run out to the river for a jump in the water. And on the way back to the room, I had a listen to the local wildlife.
After a long day, it was time for dinner. Jack had pork ribs while I had grilled mochara.
We spent the next day planning out the next steps of our journey and cracking out some uni work. For dinner, Beth had this horrible looking lasagna and I had a fantastic goulash.
The next morning we were woken up at 4 a.m. with a loud crash. We're still not entirely sure what it was, but the hotel cat decided to seek refuge in our room. After a quick water taxi back to the town, we then set off on our bus journey, which took a very long 8 hours, and we travelled from Rio Dulce to Antigua.
I'll see thee.